Since 2016, something like 6 trillion naira has been illegally printed by the central bank. When you take into account that, number one, Niger is much bigger than Nigeria, geographically speaking. Niger has a border with Libya, which is the doorway to chaos. A lot of those militants in Libya are more heavily armed than the Nigerian military itself. And the Nigerian population, most importantly, has signaled very strongly that it is going to fight with the Nigerian armed forces. That means you are not going to have 15,000 soldiers you're fighting against. You're going to have 21 million opponents. Even in a war situation, there are certain things you cannot do. So, for example, even if you're actively at war, you are not allowed to use starvation as a tool of war. It's against the Geneva Convention. It's a war crime. But that's essentially what Nigeria is doing. And you are not permitting them to get basics of survival. That's a war crime.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. New subscribers, you are highly welcome. Today, let's address the war crime committed by the Nigerian government. The denial of basic living conditions to any population is a grave concern that transcends borders and raises ethical questions. When such deprivation occurs, as it was being suggested with Niger Republic, it brings attention to potential human rights violations. In this context, David Oyedeyin labeling it war crime underscores the severity of the situation, demanding international attention and intervention. Enjoy the rest of the video. Drop your thoughts at the comment section and hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe.
The Nigerian people themselves have protested against it.
Yes.
It's not like he's representing the Nigerians.
No, he absolutely is not.
So the Nigerian people themselves are standing with the people of Niger. So speak to us a bit about how there is that split. The Nigerian elite is going one way, and the Nigerian people are saying that the government should act in another.
So I wouldn't even say the Nigerian elite, because even within the Nigerian elite, there's a significant majority of Nigeria's elite understand that this war, even from just a purely selfish point of view, it's not in Nigeria's interest, because a war economy can be beneficial under certain circumstances, but in Nigeria's current economic shape, Nigeria is not even equipped to muster a war economy, right? For every $1 that Nigeria earns, 97 cents currently going on debt servicing, not debt repayment, debt servicing. So paying off the interest on debt. Nigeria has a public finance crisis that the likes of which we have never seen before. So the only priority that Nigeria's government should have right now is how to ramp up production and exports, to start making a dent to that huge debt burden that we have, and start easing the pressure on public finances. Because since 2016, something like 6 trillion naira has been illegally printed by the central bank to fund the government, because there are no dollar incomes that are coming in from anywhere apart from crude oil. So, and even crude oil production is cratering, due to insecurity issues. So there are so many problems in country. You might have seen the news some days ago. 36 Air Force officers were ambushed.
Yeah. Yes.
And you saw the gory visuals, the videos. So a country that has this many issues internally really has no business starting a fight that it fundamentally cannot win. Yeah. Because even if you put aside the support from the Burkinabes and the Malians and the Algerians and potentially the Russians, putting that aside, even if all you are going to fight against is just 15,000 members of the Nigerian armed forces, when you take into account that, number one, Niger is much bigger than Nigeria, geographically speaking. Niger has a border with Libya, which is the doorway to chaos. A lot of those militants in Libya are more heavily armed than the Nigerian military itself. And the Nigerian population, most importantly, has signaled very strongly that it is going to fight with the Nigerian armed forces. That means you are not going to have 15,000 soldiers you're fighting against. You're going to have 21 million opponents. It's going to become Helmand province in Afghanistan or Basra in Iraq. You're going to be fighting a full-on insurgency against locals who know the terrain better than you. You're going to die. Basically, it's an unwinnable war.
Yeah.
Even the US, with all its, the most powerful military that humanity has ever known, the US couldn't win in Afghanistan, and it couldn't win in Iraq against people who are very similar to the Nigerians. The same religion, similar culture. You can't win.
You can't win.
So, and then not to talk of the Nigerian military, which is struggling with, Boko Haram. who are armed with like rusty AK-47s. How do you propose to do this? So even the Nigerian elites mostly understand that opening that doorway to chaos with Libya is a suicidal move. It makes no sense from a selfish point of view. And that the Nigerian military, which is already overstretched within the country, if you then deploy it outside the country to not just fight the Nigerian armed forces, but essentially displace them and become the armed forces of Niger.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, how exactly are you going to achieve that? And then most importantly, well, from a selfish point of view, where is the money to fund all of this?
Yeah.
You know, because the Americans they'll talk. They're not going to give you anything.
Yeah.
The French, they will make promises, but
You're on your own.
you understand how it goes. So ultimately, it's going to fall on the Nigerian people as usual.
Yeah.
To
fund this.
To bear the brunt. Another issue is Nigeria, by sort of unilaterally violating the treaties that it has had with Niger going back to 1967. So there was the Niger River Treaty in 1967 made it such that Nigeria supplies 70% of electricity that Niger consumes. And the reason for that is that Nigeria and Niger both share the Niger River. Niger is upstream of Nigeria. So Nigeria constructed the Kainji Dam, which supplies about 760 megawatts of electricity to our national grid. Now, in order to keep that dam functioning, Nigeria then signed a treaty with Niger that they would not dam their own portion of the Niger River upstream. And in return, Nigeria would supply them electricity. Now, apparently Nigeria had a problem with them and unilaterally went and shut off the electricity that supplies their schools, their hospitals, their government buildings. Apparently even the government house in Niger, in Niamey, was apparently thrown into darkness. You know, so from that point of view, has Nigeria not committed an act of war already?
Doesn't, them saying we have not yet intervened militarily kind of tone down the true consequences of the actions that they are taking presently in Niger? Exactly.
I think this was established, under the Geneva Convention, that even in a war situation, there are certain things you cannot do. So, for example, even if you are actively at war, you are not allowed to use starvation as a tool of war. It's against the Geneva Convention. It's a war crime. But that's essentially what Nigeria is doing. With Niger, you have blockaded their borders. Niger is the largest single land border that Nigeria has is with Niger. And obviously because Nigeria is the most relatively prosperous country in that immediate neighborhood of Niger, most of Niger's trade is with Nigeria. Most of Nigeria's food comes from northern Nigeria. Most of Nigeria's fuel, medicine, comes from northern Nigeria. There is a booming trade across the Jibia border points in northwestern Nigeria between Sokoto and Niger, and you've blocked it off. So basically, Nigerians, I remember seeing an article about this yesterday. Day-to-day survival has become very difficult now in that country. The food staples that they rely on. Bear in mind that in addition to being landlocked, it's also a fairly arid country. The agriculture is not great. So a lot of their food comes from Nigeria, which is a lot wetter than Niger, which is entirely Sahelian. Nigeria is like tropical and Sahelian. They are entirely Sahelian and, a bit Saharan as well. So they're a very arid country. So a lot of what they depend on for survival comes from Nigeria. And you are not permitting them to get basics of survival. That's a war crime.
Already, even before war has
exactly. So you don't have to be pointing an AK-47 at someone and shooting him dead before you've committed an act of war.